It's more interesting to pretend to be Davy Crockett hunting Comanches instead of a 10-year-old boy hunting rabbits.
When you think of Charlton Heston, you see Moses parting the Red Sea. You see Ben-Hur winning the chariot race. You see a larger-than-life figure who embodied heroes and prophets on the silver screen. But behind that commanding presence and that unmistakable voice was a man whose real life was just as remarkable as any role he ever played. A man with secrets, struggles, and a story that Hollywood rarely told. This is the secret life of Charlton Heston from the Ten Commandments. The name that wasn't his. The man the world knew as Charlton Heston wasn't born with that name. He came into the world on October 4th, 1923 in Evanston, Illinois, as John Charles Carter. The name that would eventually grace movie posters and echo through Hollywood history didn't exist yet. The transformation from John Charles Carter to Charlton Heston tells its own story about reinvention, about creating the person you need to become. His father, Russell Whitford Carter, worked as a sawmill operator, participating in his family's construction business. When Charlton was still an infant, the family moved to St. Helen, Michigan, a rural, heavily forested part of the state where civilization seemed miles away. It was isolated, quiet, and utterly removed from the glamour that would later define his life. For young John Charles Carter, those early years in the Michigan wilderness were formative. He spent his days hunting and fishing in the backwoods, wandering through forests where he could go for hours without seeing another soul. Years later, he would recall how all kids play pretend games, but he did it more than most. He would act out characters from books he'd read, staging elaborate scenes in the woods with no audience but the trees. That imagination, that tendency to lose himself in stories and characters, was already shaping the actor he would become. The isolation taught him to be comfortable alone, to create entire worlds in his mind. The wilderness taught him a kind of self-reliance that would serve him well in Hollywood, where you couldn't always count on anyone but yourself. But that idyllic life shattered when Charlton was 10 years old. His parents divorced after having 3 children, Charlton and his younger sister Leela and younger brother Alan. The divorce changed everything. His mother, Lila, remarried a man named Chester Heston shortly thereafter, and the family moved to Wilmette, Illinois, a North Shore suburb of Chicago, where the world was completely different from the Michigan woods. Young John Charles Carter took on a new identity. He adopted his stepfather's surname, becoming one of the Heston children. His 2 siblings did the same, all 3 of them shedding the Carter name like an old skin. But the first name came from somewhere more personal, his mother's maiden name, Charlton. She preferred her children use the same last name as hers, creating a unified family identity that erased the traces of Russell Whitford Carter. It was a transformation that went deeper than just paperwork. The boy from the backwoods became Charlton Heston, and that new person had to figure out how to fit into a world that felt foreign. Years later, he would recall feeling like an outsider in that new world, a skinny hick from the woods dropped into a wealthy suburb where all the other kids seemed to be rich and know about girls and live lives he couldn't comprehend. He attended New Trier High School in Wilmette, the same high school that would later be attended by Rock Hudson and Anne Margaret. It was there that something unexpected happened. He discovered theater. Even when they moved to Chicago, he remained more or less a loner, but theater gave him a place to belong, a way to channel all those hours he'd spent in the Michigan woods acting out characters from books. The turning point came when he impulsively auditioned for a high school play. He got the role, and in that moment, something clicked. He realized he was meant to be an actor. It wasn't just a hobby or a way to pass time. It was who he was supposed to be. His stage experience in high school was good enough to earn him a drama scholarship to Northwestern University. It was there, in a fundamentals of theater class, that John Charles Carter, now fully transformed into Charlton Heston, would meet the woman who would change his life forever. Even his birth certificate created confusion over the years. Some records listed him as Charlton Carter from birth, and the 1930 United States Census record for Richfield, Michigan, shows his name as being Charlton J. Carter at age 6. But later studio biographies claimed he'd been born John Charles Carter. The contradictions piled up, creating a mystery around his very name that persisted throughout his life and added to the mystique that surrounded him. But whether he was born Charlton or became Charlton, the name fit the man he would become: commanding, memorable, impossible to ignore. It sounded like a hero's name, a leader's name, the kind of name that belonged on a monument. John Charles Carter could have been anyone. Charlton Heston could only be exactly who he was. The marriage that defined him. In a town known for broken marriages and fleeting romances, Charlton Heston's relationship with his wife Lydia stood out like a beacon. Their story began in the early 1940s at Northwestern University, in a fundamentals of theater class, where two aspiring actors first crossed paths. It was one of those moments that seems ordinary at the time, but changes the entire trajectory of a life. Charlton decided almost immediately that he would marry her. It wasn't a gradual realization or a slow-burning romance. He simply knew. Looking back years later, he said he obviously found the right girl the first time out, and he had the brains to recognize it. It was the kind of instant certainty that sounds like something from a movie script, except this time it was real life. But Lydia Clark didn't fall so easily. She was from Two Rivers, Wisconsin, the daughter of a high school principal who valued education and had taught her Latin and Greek. She'd been a high school debate champion, smart and articulate, and not easily impressed by confident theater students. When she first met Charlton, she found him arrogant, conceited, and supremely self-confident. He had the kind of swagger that could rub people the wrong way. Fortunately for both of them, she gave the Illinois-bred theater student the benefit of the doubt. There was something beneath that arrogance, something genuine that made her look past the surface. Carl Sandburg had seen her perform with the Asheville Little Theater and urged her to continue her stage career. She'd planned to practice law before that comment changed her direction. She was talented, driven, and knew her own mind. They married on March 17, 1944, in Asheville, North Carolina, just before Charlton went overseas to serve in the Army Air Forces during World War II. He worked as a radio operator and aerial gunner in the Aleutian Islands, stationed in some of the most remote and challenging conditions of the war. The young couple spent their early married life separated by war, connected only through letters that crossed oceans and took weeks to arrive. Those letters became lifelines. In them, Charlton wrote about what he was experiencing, what he was thinking, what he dreamed about for their future together. Lydia wrote back from the world they'd left behind, keeping alive the connection that would define both their lives. When people talk about marriages being forged in adversity, this is what they mean. Two people who barely had time to be newlyweds before the world tore them apart, but who held on anyway. When Charlton returned from service, they moved to New York City together, living in a cold water flat in Hell's Kitchen while they both tried to break into theater. The apartment was small, cold in winter, and far from glamorous. They were struggling actors in a city full of struggling actors, with no guarantee that either of them would ever make it. At that point in their careers, Lydia was actually the more successful of the two. She performed on Broadway opposite Ralph Bellamy in Sidney Kingsley's Detective Story, which premiered in 1949. Her performance drew good notices, and she was building a reputation as a serious actress. Meanwhile, Charlton was still auditioning, still hoping for his break, still working in live television, and wondering if movies would ever happen for him. She could have focused on her own career. She could have put her ambitions first. But when Charlton started getting film offers and opportunities in Hollywood, she made a choice that would shape both their lives. She supported his career, accompanying him to auditions and events, offering insights and encouragement. Her belief in his talent was unwavering, and she frequently inspired him to take on challenging roles that showcased his versatility as an actor. Their devotion to each other became legendary in Hollywood. In an industry where scandal and affairs were almost expected, where marriages crumbled under the pressure of fame and opportunity, Charlton and Lydia were the exception. There was barely a whisper of gossip about them, no rumors of infidelity, no tabloid stories about rocky patches or trial separations. Charlton was direct about it in interviews. The reason he'd never cheated and never wanted to was that he happened to like his marriage. Nothing would be worth jeopardizing it. It was a simple statement, but in Hollywood, it was almost revolutionary. Most actors talked about the temptations, the difficulties of staying faithful when beautiful people threw themselves at you. Heston just said he liked his marriage. End of discussion. They had 2 children together. Their son, Fraser Clark Heston, was born on February 12, 1955, in Los Angeles. The timing was perfect, or perhaps perfectly timed by DeMille. Fraser would later become a film director and producer, helming the 1982 adventure film Mother Lode, starring his father. But he had the distinction of playing baby Moses in the 10 Commandments, cast in the role when he was just 3 months old. When Cecil B. DeMille heard about Fraser's birth, he sent a telegram that read, "Congratulations, he's got the part." It became a family legend, the idea that Fraser's first role was decided before he could even focus his eyes. Years later, Fraser remembered a story his mother told about filming that scene. He'd been fussing and hungry right before they were supposed to shoot, so hundreds of cast and crew members waited on the massive set while Lydia fed him a bottle. DeMille remarked afterward that never in Fraser's life would he have a more expensive meal. Their daughter, Holly Ann Heston, was adopted in 1961. Charlton had expressed a desire for one child of each gender, wanting to create a balanced family. Holly was born on August 2, 1961, and the Hestons welcomed her into their lives with the same love and commitment they brought to everything they did together. Both children would later describe their childhood as idyllic, remembering nights at home reading together, watching movies, or playing Monopoly as a family. There were no nannies raising them while the parents pursued fame. There were no boarding schools or summers away. Holly recalled that her parents were amazing parents, and that they were proud of producing 2 kids who weren't sent off to rehab, a pointed reference to so many Hollywood children who grew up damaged by their parents' fame. Lydia transformed herself during these years from actress to photographer. It started on the set of The Greatest Show on Earth in 1952, when she co-starred with her husband. DeMille's publicist asked if she could help take some on-set photos, and something clicked. She discovered she had an eye for capturing moments, for seeing the story in a single frame. When that movie wrapped, she dedicated herself to photography and raising her family. But her work wasn't just snapshots of behind-the-scenes movie moments. She became an accomplished photographer whose work was exhibited in museums and galleries around the world. She traveled to Afghanistan to photograph refugees in the Khyber Pass, to Egypt to capture the fellahin in their Nile villages, to remote corners of the world most people would never see. She ventured into the souks of Cairo with just a kid to carry her cameras, coming back with images that were stunning and revelatory. She traveled by camel, by elephant, by biplane. Her photographs were published in Time and Fortune magazines and in books like Children Around the World, Light of the World, and Mi Vida. Her son would later say she was the Indiana Jones of their family, and the description fit. Charlton often joked that his job on these adventures was to carry her cameras and equipment. The man who played Moses in Ben-Hur became a porter for his wife's artistic vision, and he did it gladly. They traveled together when they could, making their marriage a partnership in every sense of the word. In later years, they performed A.R. Gurney's Love Letters together in Australia, England, and the United States. The play, an epistolary drama about 2 people connected through a lifetime of letters, seemed to mirror their own relationship, a conversation that started in a drama class and never really ended. In 1993, they appeared in the play at Northwestern University to benefit the theater department where they'd first met. The circle was complete. The couple was married for 64 years, from 1944 until Charlton's death in 2008. Lydia passed away 10 years later, on September 3, 2018, from complications due to pneumonia. She was 95 years old. Their marriage stood as one of Hollywood's great love stories, a testament to the fact that enduring partnerships were possible even in an industry that seemed designed to tear them apart. The Moses Who Kept a Diary. When Charlton Heston went to Egypt to film The 10 Commandments in 1954, he was separated from Lydia for the first time since World War II. She was pregnant with their first child and couldn't accompany him overseas to the filming locations in the desert. So he did something remarkable. He kept a detailed journal, writing and sketching every day to share his experiences with her, to make her feel included in this monumental moment of his career. It was an act of love and thoughtfulness that showed a side of Heston the public rarely saw, the devoted husband who missed his wife and wanted to bring her into his world, even when thousands of miles separated them. The production of The 10 Commandments was unlike anything Hollywood had attempted before. Cecil B. DeMille didn't want to build sets on a studio lot and pretend they were in Egypt. He wanted the real thing. So in October 1954, the cast and crew descended on Egypt for location shooting that would become the stuff of legend. They stayed at St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai, the same holy mountain where, according to the Bible, Moses received the 10 Commandments. DeMille built the treasure city of Pharaoh Sethi at Beni Yusuf near Cairo, creating one of the largest exterior sets ever constructed for a motion picture. For the Exodus scene, 10,000 Arabs were brought in to play the children of Israel, along with 15,000 animals: camels, water buffaloes, sheep, horses, oxen, goats, ducks, geese, pigeons, dogs, and donkeys. The logistics were staggering. The heat was oppressive. The conditions were grueling. DeMille himself, then 75 years old, suffered a heart attack during production after climbing 130 feet to check a faulty camera perched on one of the giant gates used during the Exodus sequence. He took 2 days off, then returned to work against his doctor's orders to complete the film. It would be his last picture. Heston wasn't DeMille's first choice for Moses. The director initially preferred William Boyd, the actor who played Hopalong Cassidy. In DeMille's diary of screen tests, he wrote about Heston that he had a sinister quality, and you believed him, but he wasn't attractive. But DeMille changed his mind when he noticed Heston's uncanny resemblance to Michelangelo's famous statue of Moses in Rome. That resemblance sealed the deal. The filming came with unexpected challenges. Heston appeared with 9 different beards throughout the film as Moses aged from prince to prophet. He wore contact lenses and endured the scorching Egyptian sun for scenes that would last only seconds on screen. One of the film's most memorable elements was the voice of God in the burning bush scene. DeMille turned to an ancient Jewish legend that said God spoke to Moses with the voice of Amram, Moses' father, so he wouldn't be frightened. Heston's own voice was used, slightly slowed and deepened, creating an eerie effect where Moses was essentially talking to himself, to the divine within. The parting of the Red Sea took 6 months to film, combining scenes shot in Egypt with elaborate effects created in huge tanks at Paramount Studios. A U-shaped tank held 360,000 gallons of water that was released to create the effect. The footage was then reversed and spliced together with location shots, creating what was considered the most difficult special effect performed up to that time. When the Ten Commandments premiered at New York City's Criterion Theater on November 8, 1956, it was described as one of the most tumultuous film openings in years. Charlton attended with Lydia, both of them dressed to the nines, greeting a who's who of Hollywood that included John Wayne, William Holden, Tony Curtis, Janet Leigh, and Ed Sullivan himself. The film became a phenomenon. With a budget of $13.2 million, it was the most expensive film ever made at that time. It grossed $93 million and became the 8th most successful film of all time when adjusted for inflation. It made Charlton Heston a household name and gave him the role he would be most remembered for throughout his life. The civil rights activist Hollywood forgot. Long before Charlton Heston became known for his conservative politics and his presidency of the National Rifle Association, he was something very different, a passionate advocate for civil rights who put his career on the line to stand with Martin Luther King Jr. This chapter of his life has been largely forgotten or deliberately overlooked, but it deserves to be remembered. On August 28, 1963, Heston joined approximately 250,000 people at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. He stood at the Lincoln Memorial alongside Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Marlon Brando, James Garner, Paul Newman, Joanne Woodward, Burt Lancaster, and other Hollywood figures who had chartered a plane from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. About 50 actors and performers made the trip, representing a new kind of Hollywood activism, more visible, more vocal, more willing not just to be seen, but to have something to say. Organizing the Hollywood contingent wasn't easy. As president of the Screen Actors Guild at the time, Heston found himself in the middle of debates about how the actors should conduct themselves at the march. Before they left Los Angeles, he presided over a planning meeting where tensions ran high and different visions of activism clashed. Marlon Brando brought a cattle prod to the meeting, the actual weapon that had been used against civil rights demonstrators in Gadsden, Alabama. He held it up and proposed that the Hollywood group chain themselves to the Lincoln Memorial to make a more militant statement. Brando wanted drama, wanted to push boundaries, wanted to make sure their presence meant something more than just showing up. Heston disagreed strongly. He argued that they should play by the rules, that the march needed to be peaceful and lawful to be effective. He wanted the demonstration to be a responsible act of democratic process, not a spectacle that would give ammunition to those who opposed civil rights. He even threatened to bail out of the march entirely if they did anything militant. The tension between these two visions, Brando's radical activism and Heston's disciplined approach, reflected larger debates within the movement itself. The FBI added another layer of pressure. The night before the march, agents called each celebrity one by one, warning them to stay away from Washington. They said they couldn't guarantee the marchers' safety. It was an intimidation tactic, an attempt to reduce the star power and media attention the march would receive. Some people might have taken that warning seriously and stayed home, but Heston went anyway. Years later, James Garner would write in his autobiography about receiving that call and deciding to go despite the FBI's warnings. Heston made the same choice. When authorities tried to suppress the march through fear, these actors responded with courage. On the day of the march, Heston's presence was striking. He was tall, easily recognizable as Moses from the Ten Commandments, and he carried himself with the same commanding presence he brought to the screen. Photographs from that day show him standing with Poitier and Belafonte, three men of different backgrounds united in a common cause. When asked later why he marched, Heston's answer was both honest and profound. He explained that 2 years earlier, he had picketed some restaurants in Oklahoma, but with that one exception, up until very recently, like most Americans, he had expressed his support of civil rights largely by talking about it at cocktail parties. But that summer, he realized he could no longer pay only lip service to a cause that was so urgently right, in a time that was so urgently now. It was an admission that many people could relate to, the recognition that good intentions and private support weren't enough when people were being beaten in the streets, when voting rights were being denied, when segregation was the law of the land. The march represented a decision to stop talking and start acting. Immediately after the march, the United States Information Agency produced a roundtable discussion called Hollywood Roundtable. It was filmed on August 28, 1963, the same day as King's I Have a Dream speech, and it featured an extraordinary group: James Baldwin, Marlon Brando, Harry Belafonte, Charlton Heston, Joseph Mankiewicz, and Sidney Poitier, moderated by David Schoenbrunn. The USIA, formed in 1953 to improve America's image around the world, had been struggling with how to handle the civil rights movement. During the Cold War, racial inequalities in the United States were a serious public relations problem overseas. Critics of American democracy could point to segregation and discrimination as evidence that American values were hollow. The USIA decided to showcase events like the March on Washington as evidence of the vitality of the American democratic process, proof that the system could reform itself. During the roundtable filming, the conversation touched on deep issues of justice, equality, and the meaning of citizenship. Brando called for reparations for Native Americans. Baldwin spoke with the eloquence and moral clarity that made him one of the most important voices of the era, and Heston participated fully, contributing to a discussion about how to build a more just America. Heston's involvement with civil rights went deeper than one march. He had been politically active before it was fashionable in Hollywood, at a time when taking such stands could genuinely damage a career. He campaigned for Adlai Stevenson in 1956 and for John F. Kennedy in 1960, supporting Democrats at a time when much of Hollywood was still cautious about politics. His wife Lydia was equally committed. She photographed the 1963 march, capturing the massive crowds and the historic moment when King delivered his speech. She also documented tense anti-segregation protests in the South, using her camera to bear witness to both the violence of oppression and the courage of those who resisted it. The photographs weren't just art, they were evidence, documentation of history as it unfolded. African-American scholar Earl Ofari Hutchinson later said that Heston supported the rights of racial minorities before it was fashionable in Hollywood, and that we honor him for his monumental contributions to the civil rights movement. That statement matters because it comes from someone within the Black community, acknowledging Heston's genuine commitment at a time when it cost something to stand up. When Heston died in 2008, his funeral was held at St. Matthew's Parish in the Pacific Palisades, attended by about 300 people, many of them California luminaries and Hollywood figures. But a second, smaller vigil was also held in South Central Los Angeles, at the corner of Crenshaw and Martin Luther King Boulevards. That vigil, held in a predominantly Black neighborhood, far from the wealth and glamour of Pacific Palisades, was a recognition of the man he had been in 1963, before his politics shifted, before the NRA presidency, when he stood with Dr. King and put his fame behind the cause of justice. The transformation from civil rights activist to conservative icon surprised and disappointed many who had known Heston in the 1960s. He switched political parties in 1987, becoming a Republican after decades as a Democrat. In 1998, he was elected president of the National Rifle Association, where he would famously declare, "From my cold, dead hands," while holding a rifle above his head at the 2000 NRA convention. The image image became iconic, but it seemed to erase or contradict everything he'd stood for in 1963. But even that later conservatism had roots in his earlier beliefs. Heston had always valued individual rights and constitutional principles. He had always been skeptical of government overreach and protective of personal freedoms. The man who marched for voting rights and against segregation was the same man who later defended gun ownership and opposed gun control legislation. To Heston, these weren't contradictions. They were different expressions of the same fundamental belief in the rights and dignity of every individual. He saw the Constitution as a sacred document, much like he'd seen the Ten Commandments as sacred when he played Moses. And just as Moses stood up to Pharaoh to demand freedom for his people, Heston believed he was standing up to protect freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution. Whether you agreed with his later politics or not, the consistency of principle was there. A belief that rights mattered, that freedom mattered, that individuals should have the power to determine their own lives. The voice that played God. Among all the secrets and lesser-known facts about Charlton Heston, perhaps the most poetic is this. When Moses heard the voice of God in the Ten Commandments, he was hearing himself. It was Heston's own idea. He believed that to hear God would be to feel God from within. He thought it would be powerful and theologically interesting to hear the divine voice as his own voice, transformed. DeMille agreed, and the effect was created by slowing and deepening Heston's voice just slightly, making it both familiar and otherworldly at the same time. This decision spoke to something deeper about Heston's approach to acting and to life. He didn't see himself as separate from the great figures he portrayed. He found something of himself in Moses, in Ben-Hur, in all the larger-than-life heroes who made him famous. And in return, he brought something of those characters into his own life, a sense of principle, of standing for something beyond himself, of speaking with authority because he genuinely believed in what he was saying. Film critic Roger Ebert noted in Heston's obituary that he made at least 3 movies that almost everybody eventually sees: Ben-Hur, The Ten Commandments, and Planet of the Apes. Richard Corliss wrote that from start to finish, Heston was a grand, ornery anachronism, the sinewy symbol of a time when Hollywood took itself seriously, when heroes came from history books, not comic books. That voice, that unmistakable, commanding voice, became Heston's signature. It could silence a room, it could lead slaves to freedom, it could speak for God, and in his later years, it could rally conservatives around causes he believed in with the same passion he'd once brought to civil rights. The final years. On August 28, 2002, Charlton Heston made a public announcement that would mark the beginning of the end of his public life. He revealed that doctors had told him he had symptoms consistent with Alzheimer's disease. In a pre-recorded statement broadcast at a news conference at the Beverly Hills Hotel, Heston said, "I'm neither giving up nor giving in." He was 78 years old, and he approached this final challenge with the same dignity and courage he'd brought to every role he'd ever played. He finished his term as NRA president in April 2003, then made no further public appearances. The commanding voice grew quieter. The towering presence withdrew from public view. He spent his final years with Lydia in their home, away from cameras and crowds. Charlton Heston died on April 5, 2008, at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 84 years old. Lydia was by his side, as she had been for 64 years. The funeral was held at St. Matthew's Parish in the Pacific Palisades, a private service attended by about 300 people. But as mentioned earlier, a second, smaller vigil took place in South Central Los Angeles, at the corner of Crenshaw and Martin Luther King Boulevards. A reminder that even in death, Heston meant different things to different people, that his life had contained multitudes the public rarely saw. He left behind a legacy of more than 100 films over a 60-year career. He left behind a wife who had loved him from their first meeting in drama class to his last breath. He left behind 2 children, Fraser and Holly, and 3 grandchildren who carry his memory forward. But more than that, he left behind a reminder of what Hollywood had once been, a place where actors could be heroes, where movies could tell grand stories about faith and freedom and the better angels of human nature, where a man could stand 6 feet tall and speak with a voice that sounded like it could command the very seas to part. The man behind the myth. The secret life of Charlton Heston wasn't filled with scandal or hidden vices. It was something more interesting than that. It was the life of a man who chose devotion over temptation, who marched for justice before it was politically convenient, who kept a diary for his pregnant wife while filming in the Egyptian desert, who let his infant son play the baby he once was in a movie that would define his career. It was the life of a boy from the Michigan backwoods who reinvented himself as Charlton Heston, but never forgot where he came from. A man who found the right girl the first time out and had the brains to stick with her for 64 years. A man who played Moses and Ben-Hur and Michelangelo, but also played himself, the voice of God that came from within. Hollywood has changed since Heston's day. The biblical epics are gone. The 3-hour roadshow presentations with intermissions are gone. The kind of larger-than-life heroism that Heston embodied seems quaint now, old-fashioned, perhaps even a little embarrassing to modern sensibilities. But when you watch the 10 Commandments, and people still do, every year, in a tradition that has outlasted most of what Hollywood produces now, you see something that can't be replicated with computer graphics or ironic detachment. You see an actor who believed in what he was doing, who brought genuine conviction to the role of a prophet, who stood before a painted sea and made you believe it was parting. The secret of Charlton Heston's life wasn't that he was perfect, it was that he was sincere. In an industry built on illusion, he brought something real. In a town known for broken promises, he kept his. In a time when standing up for civil rights could damage a career, he stood up anyway. And in a marriage that spanned more than 6 decades, in an industry where marriages rarely lasted 6 months, he loved one woman from beginning to end. That's the secret life of Charlton Heston from the 10 Commandments. Not scandalous, not shocking, but in its own way, more remarkable than any role he ever played. The next time you see that image of Moses holding the stone tablets, or Ben-Hur standing in his chariot, or even that scene from Planet of the Apes that became a meme, remember the man behind the performance. Remember John Charles Carter from Michigan, who became Charlton Heston and played prophets and heroes while living a life that had its own quiet heroism. If you enjoyed this look at the man behind the movies, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories about the golden age of Hollywood and the people who made it unforgettable. Thanks for watching.